It was almost midnight when Sophie's phone lit up on her bedside table. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel louder than it should. She reached over, half asleep, and when she saw the name glowing on her screen, and her sleep vanished. Her heart gave a small, sharp beat. She didn't hesitate. She picked up, "Hey," she whispered softly. There was a pause on the other end. Then came his voice, low, rough, and tired. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Everything just feels heavy." Sophie sat up, turning on the small lamp beside her bed. She could picture him perfectly sitting on his couch, staring at nothing, lost in memories that refused to fade. Ever since his breakup with Lila, Ethan hadn't been himself. He laughed less, talked less, and carried a quiet sadness in everything he did. Sophie had seen it all happen from the sidelines. She'd been his closest friend for years, and watching him fall apart had been harder than she wanted to admit. "Do you want to come over?" she asked gently. There was a small sigh of relief from his end. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks, Soph." 15 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Sophie wrapped herself in a cozy sweater and opened it. Ethan stood there, his jacket damp from the night air, eyes red but trying to stay strong. He gave her a weak smile. "You look tired," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Haven't been sleeping much?" Sophie stepped aside to let him in. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla and coffee, familiar and warm, the kind of comfort that didn't need words. Ethan sat on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Sophie poured him a cup of tea and sat across from him. For a while, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that only close friends could share. Finally, he said, "It's strange. You spend years with someone, you build plans, you believe it'll last forever. And then suddenly, it's just gone." Sophie nodded slowly. Losing someone like that, it's not just the person you miss. It's the version of you that existed with them. He looked at her, eyes soft. "Yeah, that's exactly it." They sat like that for a while, sipping tea, the ticking of the wall clock the only sound between them. Sophie wanted to tell him that time would heal him, that he would move on, that he'd find someone better. But those words felt too small for what he was feeling. So instead, she listened. She let him talk about Lila, about how perfect things had been, how fast they'd fallen apart, how empty he felt now. As he spoke, Sophie felt something ache quietly inside her. Not jealousy, she had never hated Lila, but something close to longing. She had always admired the way Ethan loved. He loved deeply, fearlessly. And part of her had always wondered what it would be like if someone loved her that way. When he finally stopped talking, Ethan leaned back and looked at the ceiling. "Sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean to dump all that on you again." Sophie smiled faintly. "That's what friends are for, right?" He looked at her then, really looked. And for a moment, something in his expression softened. "You always know what to say," he said quietly. She laughed under her breath. "I'm not sure I do. I just know how to listen." There was another long pause, but it didn't feel uncomfortable this time. It felt like a space where something new might begin. The kind of silence that holds a question neither person wants to ask. Ethan's gaze lingered on her. And Sophie felt the weight of it. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not just as his best friend, but as someone who'd been there all along, quietly steady while his world fell apart. The air between them shifted just slightly. Sophie stood and walked to the kitchen, trying to break the tension. "Do you want something to eat?" she asked. "I made pasta earlier." He shook his head. "No, I'm good." He hesitated, then added, "But can I just stay here for a while? I don't want to go home yet." "Of course," she said. "You can crash here." He smiled, a little tired, grateful. "Thanks, Soph." Sophie sat beside him on the couch this time, not across from him. The TV played quietly in the background, some old movie neither of them cared about. Ethan leaned back, eyes half closed, and let out a slow breath. For the first time in weeks, he looked peaceful. After a few minutes, he said softly, "You know, she never listened the way you do. With Lila, I always felt like I had to hold things in, like I couldn't show weakness." Sophie turned her head toward him. Everyone needs a place to fall apart sometimes. Ethan's eyes met hers. You're that place for me. Her chest tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. But her silence spoke louder than words. Minutes passed. The sound of rain began against the window, soft, rhythmic, almost soothing. Ethan's hand brushed against hers on the couch, not intentionally, but not entirely by accident either. Neither of them moved it away. Sophie looked down at their hands, the warmth between them quiet and steady. A part of her knew this was dangerous. He was still broken, still healing, but another part of her didn't care. She just wanted him to feel safe, to feel cared for, even if it wasn't her place. Eventually, Ethan's voice broke the quiet. I don't think I've thanked you properly, he said. For what? For being here. For not giving up on me. Sophie smiled softly. You don't thank people for caring, Ethan? He looked at her then, eyes tired but gentle. Maybe not. But I still mean it. The clock on the wall struck 1. Sophie got up and grabbed a blanket, tossing it gently over him. Get some rest, she said. You need it. He nodded, lying down on the couch. What about you? I'll stay up a bit, she said, sitting in the armchair across from him. Make sure you don't steal my blanket. He laughed quietly. I'll behave. As the room dimmed and the sound of rain grew softer, Sophie watched him drift off. His face relaxed in sleep, the sadness slipping away for just a little while. She pulled her knees to her chest and whispered to herself, You're going to be okay. Up. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she was saying it for him or for herself. And as the night stretched on, Sophie realized that sometimes helping someone heal meant losing a little piece of yourself along the way. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that quiet moment, with the rain falling and the city asleep around them, she knew one thing for sure: something between them had changed. Something neither of them could take back. In the weeks after that quiet night, Ethan started showing up at Sophie's apartment more often. At first, it was just for coffee or a quick chat after work, but soon it became routine diners together, movie nights, late-night talks that stretched until dawn. The sadness in his eyes began to fade little by little. He laughed more now, and Sophie could see glimpses of the old Ethan returning. She told herself she was just being a good friend, helping him find his way back to himself. But deep down, she knew it was becoming something more. It was a rainy Sunday when Ethan showed up at her door again, carrying takeout and a half-smile. You're not cooking tonight, he said. My treat. Sophie laughed. Since when do you bring dinner? Since I figured out you forget to eat when you're working, he teased, setting the food down. They sat together at her small kitchen table, sharing pasta and stories about their week. It felt easy too easy. Every joke, every look lingered a second too long. Sophie tried to ignore the warmth in her chest whenever he smiled at her, but it was getting harder. After dinner, they watched an old romantic comedy. Halfway through, Ethan leaned back on the couch and said, You know, I used to watch this with Lila, but it feels different now. Sophie hesitated. Different how? He looked at her, his expression soft. Better. The word hung in the air, and Sophie didn't know what to do with it. She felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay calm. He was still healing, still trying to understand his own feelings. She couldn't let herself believe this meant anything. Not yet. As the movie played on, Sophie found herself watching him instead of the screen. His eyes looked lighter now, his shoulders more relaxed. He had started smiling in that real, effortless way again. She was proud of that. She'd helped him reach this point. But the more he healed, the more she realized how deeply she cared for him. And that scared her. A few days later, they went for a drive along the coast. The sky was clear, the wind gentle. Ethan rolled down the windows, and the sound of waves filled the car. I missed this, he said, just being out here. Breathing again. Sophie smiled, watching him from the passenger seat. You're finally letting yourself move forward. 'Cause of you, he said simply. She turned away, looking out at the ocean to hide her expression. I just listened, Ethan. He shook his head. You did more than that? You've reminded me that life doesn't stop after heartbreak. His words touched something deep inside her. For a moment, she imagined what it would be like if he looked at her not as a friend, but as someone he could love. The thought scared her and thrilled her. They stopped by a small coffee shop overlooking the water. As they sat outside, Ethan looked thoughtful. "You know," he said, stirring his drink, "I think I held on to Lila longer than I should have. I was scared to be alone." Sophie nodded. "That's normal. Everyone does that. Now," he continued, "being around you. It doesn't feel like loneliness anymore." She froze. His eyes were steady, honest, but there was something new in them, something that made her heart beat faster. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she didn't. Some questions are too dangerous to ask. That evening, they walked along the shore as the sun went down. The sky burned orange and pink, and their footsteps left small prints in the sand. Ethan's hand brushed against hers, light and uncertain. Sophie didn't pull away. When he looked at her, his voice was soft. "You make things feel normal again." She smiled faintly. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." They stopped walking. The ocean whispered quietly beside them, and for a moment it felt like the world had paused. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. Sophie felt her breath catch, and before she could say anything, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was such a small, simple gesture, yet it felt too intimate, too charged. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan." He pulled his hand back slowly, realizing what he'd done. "Sorry, I didn't mean it's okay," she said quickly, though her heart was racing. They stood in silence for a few seconds before turning back toward the car. Neither spoke on the drive home. The air between them had changed. Again, something fragile and unspoken had entered it. That night, Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She replayed every word, every glance, every moment from the evening. She knew she was crossing an invisible line. She was supposed to be his safe place, not the person complicating his recovery. But emotions don't listen to reason. She couldn't stop thinking about him, his laughter, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her like she was the only one who understood him. The next few days were filled with awkward quietness. They still texted, still met up, but the easy comfort they once had was now shadowed by something unsaid. When Ethan sat beside her, she could feel the tension in his silence. When their hands accidentally brushed, both pulled away too quickly. One evening, as they watched another movie, he suddenly said, "You've been my constant, Sophie, through everything. I don't think I could have done this without you." Sophie forced a smile. "You give me too much credit." "No," he said firmly. "You've been the reason I didn't fall apart completely." She looked away. His honesty was both beautiful and painful. She wanted to tell him that helping him had changed her too, that somewhere between comforting him and listening to him, she'd started falling for him. But she stayed quiet, because the last thing she wanted was to ruin what they had. Later that night, when he leaned his head on her shoulder, Sophie froze. His weight felt comforting, familiar, but she could feel her heart pounding. She knew she should move, say something, break the moment, but she didn't. She stayed still, letting him rest there. The warmth of him, the quiet of the room, the sound of the rain outside, it all blended into something soft and dangerous. Then, just as her eyes began to close, Ethan murmured something that made her heart stop. "I wish she could have been like you." The words sank deep, heavier than he realized. Sophie's throat tightened. He didn't mean it romantically, she knew that, but it still hurt. Because in that moment she realized she was falling for someone who still compared everything to his past. When he finally left that night, Sophie sat on her couch long after the door closed. The city lights blinked through her window, but she didn't see them. Her heart ached in a quiet, painful way. She wanted to help him heal, but helping him was breaking her. And yet, even as she wiped a tear from her cheek, she knew she wouldn't stop. Because sometimes love doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it arrives in silence. In the soft moments between heartbreak and hope, when two people are trying to find themselves, and instead find each other. By the time spring arrived, Ethan had changed. The sadness that once clouded his eyes was fading, replaced by something brighter. He laughed again, made plans again, started living again. Sophie was proud of him. She'd seen him rebuild piece by piece. But deep inside, she was fighting a quiet battle. The more he healed, the more she realized how deeply she cared for him. Every time he smiled, every time he called her name, something in her heart stirred. One Friday afternoon, Ethan called her and said, "Let's get away for a bit. Just a weekend. No city, no noise, just air and quiet." Sophie hesitated. "You sure you don't want to go with your friends?" He laughed. "You are my best friend, Soph. Come on, you could use a break too," she agreed. By sunset, they were driving out of Seattle, windows down, music playing softly, the golden sky melting behind the hills. It felt free, effortless. The kind of trip that didn't need plans, just two people escaping the world for a little while. They reached a small lakeside cabin surrounded by pine trees. The air smelled fresh, clean. Inside the cabin was cozy, one big room, a fireplace, and two couches facing the lake. Ethan dropped his bag and turned to her with a grin. "Not bad, right?" Sophie smiled. "You really needed this, didn't you?" He nodded. "Yeah, I didn't realize how much I missed peace." That night, they sat outside on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars shimmer over the still water. The quiet was almost magical. For the first time in months, Ethan looked completely at ease. "This," he said softly, "feels like breathing again." Sophie glanced at him, her heart full. "You deserve it." He smiled, turning toward her. "You've been there for me through everything. I still don't know how to thank you." "Just be happy," she said. "That's enough." But Ethan shook his head. "You say that like your happiness doesn't matter." She looked away, trying to hide her face. "It's not about me." He studied her quietly. "I think it is." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The firelight flickered across their faces, warm and soft. Sophie could feel the air change, like something unspoken was waiting between them. The next morning, they went hiking through the woods nearby. The air was cool, filled with birdsong and the smell of pine. They talked to Isolai about work, about dreams, about nothing at all. When they reached the top of a hill overlooking the lake, they stopped to catch their breath. The view was breathtaking, the sun reflecting off the water. The mountains in the distance. Ethan stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "You ever think about how weird life is?" he asked. "You lose someone, think you'll never recover, and then suddenly someone else is there helping you heal." Sophie smiled faintly. "Life always surprises us." He turned to her, eyes steady. "You surprised me the most." Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "You make me want to be better," he said. "You make me feel like I can start over." His words hit deeper than she expected. She wanted to believe them, but a part of her was scared that he was confusing gratitude for love. Comfort for connection. She forced a small laugh. "You're just saying that because I've been patient with you." He stepped closer. "No, I'm saying it because it's true." For a heartbeat, the world went still. The only sounds were the wind and their uneven breathing. Sophie looked up at him, and he looked down at her. The distance between them seemed to vanish. Ethan reached out and brushed his fingers against her hand. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stopped, sensing her hesitation. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Sometimes I don't know what I'm feeling." Sophie took a small step back. "You're still healing. You think this is something it's not?" He frowned, confused. "What if it is something real?" She sighed, looking at the lake below. "You were broken, Ethan. I helped you pick up the pieces. But that doesn't mean those pieces belong to me." Ethan fell silent. The wind blew through the trees, and for a while, neither spoke. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. "Maybe you're right. But maybe love starts exactly like this, when someone helps you find yourself again." Sophie didn't respond. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They walked back to the cabin in silence. That evening, neither could look at the other for too long. The tension was thick, but beneath it was something tender, something neither wanted to lose. Later that night, Ethan lit a fire and sat down on the rug near it. Sophie joined him, wrapping herself in a blanket. The light flickered across his face, making his expression softer, gentler. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe I've been too focused on what I lost. Maybe I should start focusing on what I've found." Sophie stared into the fire. "What have you found?" He hesitated. Her heart stuttered. She wanted to stop him, to remind him that he was still figuring things out, but she couldn't find the words. She could only look at him, this man who had once been so broken. Now sitting beside her, trying to rebuild his heart piece by piece, she reached for her mug, hands shaking slightly. "Ethan, you don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to," he said quietly. "I'm saying it because I feel it." The silence that followed was deep and fragile. Sophie could feel her heart pulling in two directions, wanting him, but afraid of losing him. Finally, she stood up, needing space to breathe. "You're getting better, Ethan. That's all I wanted. Don't mix healing with love." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe healing is love. The words hit her harder than he knew. She turned away, afraid he'd see the tears forming in her eyes. Sophie stared into the fire. "What have you found?" He hesitated. "You?" Her heart stuttered. She wanted to stop him, to remind him that he was still figuring things out, but she couldn't find the words. She could only look at him, this man who had once been so broken, now sitting beside her, trying to rebuild his heart piece by piece. She reached for her mug, hands shaking slightly. "Ethan, you don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to," he said quietly. "I'm saying it because I feel it." The silence that followed was deep and fragile. Sophie could feel her heart pulling in two directions, wanting him, but afraid of losing him. Finally, she stood up, needing space to breathe. "You're getting better, Ethan. That's all I wanted. Don't mix healing with love." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe healing is love. The words hit her harder than he knew. She turned away, afraid he'd see the tears forming in her eyes. "Get some rest," she said softly. "We'll head back in the morning." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her as if searching for something she wasn't ready to give. That night, as Sophie lay awake, listening to the soft crackle of the fire, she thought about everything he'd said. She had wanted to help him heal, to be the friend he could lean on. But somewhere along the line, she had become part of his healing, and that terrified her. Because when people heal, they move forward. And she didn't know if that meant toward her or away from her. As dawn crept through the window, Sophie realized something she had been avoiding. Feelings, once born, don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. And so had he. When Ethan woke and smiled at her over coffee, everything looked normal on the outside, but both of them knew the truth. Something had shifted forever between them. Something that neither friendship nor time could ever undo. Months passed after that weekend at the cabin. Spring melted into early summer, and life began to move again. Ethan started a new job at a design firm downtown. He looked stronger now, more focused, his laughter easy and real. To anyone else, he seemed completely fine. But Sophie knew better. She could see it in his eyes sometimes, how he'd look at her a second too long, how silence between them still carried. Everything they hadn't said, that their friendship had survived the quiet tension between them, but something had changed. They didn't talk about it, yet it lived in every look and every pause. Sophie kept telling herself it was for the best. He was healing, moving on, finding his rhythm again. That was all she'd ever wanted for him. But every time he smiled at her, she felt a soft ache. A reminder of all the words she never said. One Friday night, Ethan invited her to his apartment. It was his first real housewarming after settling in. When she walked in, she noticed the difference immediately. The space felt brighter, warmer. There were sketches pinned on the wall, plants by the window, and soft music playing in the background. "You've really made this place yours," she said, looking around. He grinned. "Took me a while, but it finally feels like home." They sat on the couch sipping coffee. It felt easy again, familiar, but the air between them still held something unspoken. Ethan leaned back, his voice calm. I've been thinking a lot lately about everything that happened. Sophie looked at him carefully. You mean the breakup? He shook his head. No, about after that. About you. Her stomach tightened. Ethan, he stopped her gently. Let me say this. He took a breath. When I lost Lila, I thought I'd never feel whole again. Then you showed up and you stayed. You listened. You reminded me I was still worth something. I don't think I ever thanked you for that properly. She smiled softly. You don't have to thank me. I do, he said, because you saved me from disappearing into my own sadness. He paused, then added quietly, but somewhere along the way, I realized something else. I stopped thinking about her, and I started thinking about you. Sophie's heart pounded. She looked away, staring at the cup in her hands. Ethan, don't do this to yourself. You're still figuring things out. He smiled faintly. I'm not confused, Soph. I was for a long time, but not anymore. She felt her throat tighten. You're just grateful. That's all. He leaned forward, his tone calm but certain. Gratitude doesn't feel like this. Gratitude doesn't make your heart stop when someone smiles. His words left her speechless. She didn't know what to say. Everything inside her screamed to keep things simple, to protect what they had, but part of hers some quiet. Desperate part wanted to believe him. After a long pause, she said softly, Ethan, when people go through heartbreak, they sometimes attach their healing to the person who helps them. It doesn't always mean it's love. He nodded slowly. Maybe, but maybe it does. Sophie sighed, her voice trembling. If we cross that line, Ethan, everything changes. He smiled gently. It already did. The room went quiet. The city lights outside flickered through the window, painting faint gold lines across the walls. Sophie looked at him, really looked. Saw not the broken man who'd shown up at her door months ago, but someone stronger, someone whole. And yet, she also saw herself the woman who had fallen for him while pretending not to. He reached for her hand. And this time, she didn't pull away. His touch was warm, steady, and kind. I don't want to rush you, he said quietly. I just needed you to know how I feel. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. Sophie held his hand for a moment before gently pulling it back. Ethan, I care about you more than you realize. But love built on pain is fragile. Let's not break what's already beautiful. He nodded, though his eyes showed disappointment. Then what are we, Sophie? She smiled sadly. We're two people who helped each other heal. Maybe that's what we were meant to be. They sat in silence for a while after that, listening to the quiet hum of the city. It wasn't awkward, just heavy, real. The kind of silence that follows honesty. A week later, Sophie invited him over for dinner. Things felt easier again, but not like before. They were careful, now gentle, thoughtful, aware of the space between them. After dinner, they sat on her balcony, watching the skyline glow in the distance. The air was warm, and the city below buzzed with life. Ethan looked out over the lights and said, You were the one who stayed. Sophie turned to him, smiling faintly. That's what friends do. He shook his head softly. No, that's what love does. She went still. The words landed softly, not as a confession this time, but as a truth he didn't need to explain. There was no pressure in his voice, no rushed, just calm certainty. Sophie looked down, her voice quiet. Then let's not call it love yet. Let's just let it be what it is. Ethan nodded. Okay, whatever this is, it's enough for me. He reached for her hand again, and she let him hold it. They sat there quietly, two souls who had been broken once, now slowly finding peace beside each other. The air was calm, the world around them soft and forgiving. Sophie felt something inside her settle. For months, she'd been afraid of what would happen if they crossed the line. Afraid of losing him, afraid of feeling too much. But now, sitting beside him, she realized that maybe healing wasn't about avoiding pain. Maybe it was about allowing yourself to feel again, to trust again, even if it scared you. As the night deepened, Ethan turned to her. Do you ever think about how strange it is? How the person you meet when you're broken ends up being the one who puts you back together. Sophie smiled, her eyes soft. I think that's how life works sometimes. You fall apart so someone can help you see who you really are. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, Then I'm glad it was you. The wind brushed gently through her hair, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie didn't feel guilty for what she felt. She didn't feel like she was stealing something or holding on to someone else's past. This, whatever it was, felt right. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't need to be. When Ethan finally stood to leave, he paused at the door and said, I don't know where this goes. Soph, but I know I don't want to lose you again. She smiled softly. Then don't. He nodded, eyes warm, and left. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, and Sophie stood by the door for a moment, her heart calm. She knew things wouldn't be simple, but they didn't need to be. They'd both found something worth holding on to, something honest. Something real. As she turned off the lights and stepped onto the balcony one last time. She looked up at the stars and whispered, We helped each other heal. And maybe that's where love begins. And for the first time, she believed it.